I'm Coleman Hughes, writer and columnist for Quillette magazine. Welcome to Cafe Classroom. When's the last time you heard good news about the state of Black America? And I don't mean just Donald Trump bragging about the unemployment rate that we all know could change, reverse course in the next recession. I mean really good news about how Black people are doing in America. Think about it. I can't. And I don't think I'm unusual in that respect. I think the way the topic is reported on in the media, you get this picture of constant doom and gloom. Black people are disproportionately poor, disproportionately incarcerated, disproportionately harassed and killed by cops. You have the test score gap, the school to prison pipeline, the 10-to-1 wealth gap. These are the things that you hear if you're sort of a member of the reading public or if you're just watching the news. Today I'm going to talk about progress, and specifically the progress that Black people have made since roughly the year 2000 that almost nobody knows about. And I'm going to get right into it. I'll start with incarceration. We have mass incarceration in this country. We incarcerate a higher percentage of our population than any country in the world, and yet we have made massive, stunning progress since roughly I was in kindergarten. I'm 23 right now. So between the time I was in kindergarten and my first legal drink, the incarceration rate for Black men aged 18 to 19 dropped by 72%. The incarceration rate for Black men aged 20 to 24 dropped by 60%. Incarceration rate for Black men aged 25 to 29 dropped by 59%. Story is the same for women, which is to say Black men in their 20s and late teens, the odds that they are in jail have more than cut in half since I was in kindergarten. That's pretty astonishing. The story is the same for teenage birth. The teenage birth rate has dropped by 63% for Black women aged 15 to 19 since 2001. Incarceration is not the only domain where we've seen progress. We've seen progress in terms of deaths from disease. Among Black Americans 65 years of age and older, deaths from heart disease are down 43% since the new millennium. Deaths from diabetes are down 31%. Cancer is down 29%. Life expectancy is up 3.5 years for women and 3 years for men since the turn of the millennium. In education, we've seen gains. The number of bachelor's degrees awarded to Black students is up 82%. Numbers of master's degrees and associate's degrees has more than doubled since the new millennium. And along with that has come increased upward mobility. So the Federal Reserve just recently reported that over 60% of Black people at every level of education report doing better financially than their parents did, which is a higher percentage than both whites and Hispanics. And while Black men have still lagged very far behind white men in terms of upward mobility, it is now true, according to Raj Chetty, the celebrated economist, that Black women go on to earn more than white women from similar socioeconomic backgrounds. So all of this progress has happened, and almost nobody knows about it. Why is that? Well, one reason is that there are almost no incentives to report this based on your political tribe and your political affiliations. Which is to say, both Democrats and Republicans, for different reasons, rely on the picture of Black America as stagnating and as in dire straits. For Democrats, the facts that testify to Black stagnation are evidence of entrenched racism, the legacy of white supremacy. So progress, therefore, would be an indication that our systems aren't all that bad for Black people. Indeed, if our prison system could allow a 72% drop in the odds that a Black male teenager is in prison in less than 2 decades, it's hard to see how our prison system is racist from front to back, as Elizabeth Warren recently said. On the right, there is a narrative most famously expressed in Donald Trump's paltry appeal for the black vote when he said, you have no jobs, you're living in poverty, your schools are no good, what the hell do you have to lose by voting Trump? Which many people found very insulting. But notice it's premised on the same picture, that black America is in dire straits. So there's virtually no political incentive to note progress when it happens. But there is probably very little we can do about that because political incentives aren't likely to change. There is something we can do to highlight black progress when it happens, because the way black progress gets obscured is a consequence of the habit of comparing black outcomes to white outcomes, rather than comparing black outcomes to black outcomes at an earlier point in time. So I started out by noting the 72% decline in the incarceration rate for black men aged 18 to 19 between the time I was in kindergarten and my first legal drink. Framed that way, that sounds like a huge improvement, right? We're talking about cutting in half twice in less than 2 decades. However, you can look at the same exact data and make it seem like the opposite of progress, right? So the same exact data that I just described could also be stated this way. In 2001, black men of that age were 9 times as likely to be in prison compared to white men. Now they are 12 times as likely to be in prison compared to white men. That sounds like regress. And our habit of talking in terms of gaps obscures all that progress. So let me just make it very clear what's happening here. And then we can decide which framing seems like a more honest portrayal of what's gone on in America. Let's say you have 100. Let's say you have 100 black people in prison in the year 2001, and 10 white people in prison. Let's say by 2017, you cut in half the number of blacks in prison, and you reduce the number of whites in prison also by half. If you only look at the gaps, there's a 10-to-1 gap at both times, right? Yet the total black prison population is like 50 people fewer versus the white one's only 5 people fewer. Our habit of looking at gaps systematically obscures progress to the point where you can make what is objectively an amazing trend look like nothing's happened. So what we have to do to fix this is every time you see a racial disparity or a racial gap, you have to ask yourself whether the way of looking at the data is the most useful one for getting a picture of what is actually going on, right? What's implicit in the gap-based view of the world is that if we cut the incarceration rate for black people by 72% for young black men in 2 decades, you have to look at what happened for white people before you know whether to score that as progress. That doesn't make much sense, right? If almost half as many people, black people, are dying of heart disease as were 2 decades ago, we shouldn't have to look at the white rate before we know whether to score that as progress. And there's a couple things we gain by looking at progress. One is we have this meme of systemic racism, that white supremacy is so entrenched in our systems that they need essentially to be burned to the ground and created anew. Now, of course, racism is real. Racism exists. But if if we're seeing massive progress among black people in education, in health, in prison, in the crime rate, it's hard to justify the sense that our systems need to be burned to the ground. What we really need is for the systems to be tweaked, because they are, on balance, working for black people. And more importantly, if the project of society is to figure out what works and what doesn't, you have to pay attention to both halves of that equation. Journalists are very quick to point out problems in society, which makes perfect sense. You want to know what doesn't work so that you can fix it. But they tend to be very slow to point out progress. And if you want to know what works, we have to understand the source of these positive trends so that we can repeat them, right? So in sum, black people have made massive progress in virtually every domain worth caring about in recent decades. And much of that progress has been obscured by bad intellectual habits and bad political incentives. But a full conversation about race and racial inequality has to involve not just what goes wrong, but what goes right. Because if we don't know the triumphs of our recent history, we're doomed not to repeat them. Thank you.